When Dr. Harrison looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You're not getting any younger, Elena. At 58 you need to accept that some things just wear out," I knew something was terribly wrong, not with my body, but with him. 3 months later, I discovered a $2.3 million insurance fraud scheme that had been systematically targeting older patients for years. When I confronted my new doctor with the evidence, the words that came out of my mouth changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and for 23 years I trusted Dr. Benjamin Harrison with my life. I was 35 when I first walked into his clinic in downtown Phoenix, a young marketing executive dealing with stress headaches and irregular periods. Dr. Harrison seemed like the answer to my prayers back then. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like he'd stepped out of a medical textbook. His office was pristine, his diplomas impressive, and his bedside manner was exactly what you'd expect from someone who charged premium rates. Over the years, Dr. Harrison guided me through perimenopause, helped me navigate career stress, and treated everything from bronchitis to minor injuries. I recommended him to friends, colleagues, even my sister Isabella when she moved to Phoenix 5 years ago. He was more than my doctor. He was someone I trusted implicitly with the most intimate details of my health and well-being. That trust began to crack on a Tuesday morning in March, when I went in for what should have been a routine annual physical. I'd been experiencing some fatigue and joint stiffness that I attributed to long hours at my consulting firm and the general wear and tear of approaching 60. Nothing dramatic, nothing that interfered with my daily life, just the kind of minor complaints that seem to accumulate as birthdays pile up. Dr. Harrison's examination was more cursory than usual. He spent maybe 10 minutes checking my vitals, listening to my heart, and making notes in his tablet. When I mentioned the fatigue and joint pain, his response was immediate and dismissive. "Elena, you're 58 years old, your body is slowing down, and these symptoms are completely normal for someone your age. You need to adjust your expectations." I sat on the examination table in my paper gown, feeling oddly diminished by his tone. This wasn't the same Dr. Harrison, who had spent 45 minutes with me just 2 years earlier, carefully discussing hormone replacement therapy options and ordering comprehensive blood work to rule out thyroid issues when I mentioned similar but less pronounced symptoms. "But doctor, the fatigue is really affecting my work performance. Some mornings I can barely get out of bed, and the joint pain is..." He cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Elena, I'm going to be frank with you. You're not getting any younger. These are age-related changes, and the sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be. I can prescribe some anti-inflammatory medication for the joint pain, but fundamentally, this is just your body telling you to slow down." The dismissal in his voice was something I'd never heard before. In all our years together, Dr. Harrison had been thorough, attentive, genuinely interested in finding solutions to health problems. This felt like he was talking to a different person entirely. "What about blood work? Last time you ran a complete panel to check for." At your age, extensive testing is rarely cost-effective. Your insurance company is already questioning the necessity of some of the tests I've been ordering for my older patients. We need to be more selective about what we investigate. Insurance company, that was the first red flag, though I didn't recognize it at the time. In 23 years, Dr. Harrison had never once mentioned insurance limitations when recommending treatment. He'd always focused on what was medically appropriate, not what was financially convenient. I left his office that day, with a prescription for ibuprofen and a lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted in our doctor-patient relationship. The Elena Rodriguez, who had built a successful consulting business and prided herself on advocating for her clients, was somehow unable to advocate for herself in that medical office. I'd been reduced to my age, as if turning 58 had magically transformed me from a person with legitimate health concerns into a hypochondriac who needed to accept inevitable decline. The prescription didn't help. If anything, my symptoms got worse over the following weeks. The fatigue became so severe that I started canceling client meetings, something I'd never done in my career. The joint pain spread from my hands and knees to my shoulders and hips, making simple tasks like opening jars or climbing stairs genuinely difficult. I called Dr. Harrison's office 3 times over the next month, asking for additional tests or a referral to a specialist. Each time, his nurse Kelly returned my call with the same message. Harrison recommended I give the anti-inflammatory medication more time to work, and perhaps consider that stress and aging were the primary factors in my symptoms. It was my sister Isabella who finally pushed me to seek a second opinion. She'd been watching me struggle for weeks, seeing me decline in ways that had nothing to do with normal aging. Isabella is 5 years younger than me, but she'd been dealing with her own health challenges and had recently switched to a new doctor after becoming frustrated with her previous physician's dismissive attitude. "Elena, this isn't you," she said one Saturday afternoon as we sat in my living room. I'd canceled our planned shopping trip because I was too exhausted to leave the house. "You've always been the Energizer Bunny of the family. You built your business from nothing, you run marathons, you travel all over the country for work. This isn't normal aging." She handed me a business card. "Dr. Sarah Chen. She's young, maybe early 30s, but she's brilliant. She actually listens to her patients, and she doesn't dismiss symptoms just because you're over 50. I stared at the card, feeling oddly guilty about the idea of seeing another doctor. After more than 2 decades with Dr. Harrison, switching felt like betrayal. But as I sat there in my pajamas at 3 in the afternoon, too tired to shower and too achy to think clearly, I realized that loyalty to a doctor who wasn't helping me was just another form of self-sabotage. Dr. Chen's office was nothing like Dr. Harrison's sterile, intimidating clinic. The waiting room had comfortable chairs, natural lighting, and actual magazines from this decade, instead of the ancient issues of Time and Newsweek that had been gathering dust in Dr. Harrison's waiting area since the Obama administration. The staff seemed genuinely friendly, rather than efficiently polite, and when Dr. Chen called my name herself instead of sending a nurse, I was already impressed. Dr. Sarah Chen was indeed young, probably in her early 30s, as Isabella had said, with short black hair and bright intelligent eyes behind fashionable glasses. She wore scrubs instead of the formal business attire that Dr. Harrison favored, and she shook my hand with genuine warmth when she introduced herself. "Miss Rodriguez, please tell me what's been going on with your health lately. I want to hear everything, starting from the beginning." For the first time in months, I felt heard. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting as I described my symptoms, my previous doctor's dismissal, and my growing frustration with feeling like I was losing control of my own body. She took notes by hand in addition to her electronic records, asking clarifying questions that showed she was actually processing what I was telling her. "How long did you say you've been experiencing these symptoms?" "About 4 months, but they've gotten significantly worse in the last 6 weeks. And your previous physician attributed this to normal aging. He said I needed to accept that my body was slowing down and adjust my expectations." Dr. Chen's expression darkened slightly. "Miss Rodriguez, 58 is not old. My patients in their 70s and 80s are running businesses, traveling the world, and maintaining active, fulfilling lives. Debilitating fatigue and widespread joint pain are symptoms that deserve investigation, regardless of your age." She spent the next hour conducting the most thorough physical examination I'd ever experienced. She checked my reflexes, examined my joints for swelling and range of motion, palpated my abdomen and lymph nodes, and asked detailed questions about my family history, lifestyle, and work environment. "I'm going to order some blood work," she said as she finished the examination. "We'll check your complete blood count, comprehensive metabolic panel, thyroid function, vitamin levels, inflammatory markers, and autoimmune indicators. I also want to test for Lyme disease and a few other conditions that can cause symptoms like yours." My previous doctor said extensive testing wasn't cost-effective for someone my age. Dr. Chen looked genuinely puzzled. "Cost-effective for whom? Your insurance covers these tests, and even if it didn't, your health is worth investigating properly. I've never had an insurance company question basic diagnostic work for symptoms like yours." That was the second red flag, though I still didn't understand its significance. Why would Dr. Harrison claim my insurance was questioning necessary tests, when Dr. Chen had no concerns about coverage for the same diagnostics? The blood work results came back within a week, and Dr. Chen called me personally to discuss them. My vitamin D levels were severely deficient, my inflammatory markers were elevated, and my thyroid was functioning at the low end of normal, which could explain both the fatigue and joint pain. The good news is that these are all treatable conditions, Dr. Chen explained. I'm prescribing high-dose vitamin D supplements and a low-dose thyroid medication. We'll recheck your levels in 6 weeks, but I expect you'll start feeling significantly better within a month. That's it, just supplements and thyroid medication. Sometimes the simplest explanations are the correct ones. Your previous doctor should have caught these deficiencies with basic blood work. I'm honestly surprised they weren't investigated months ago. I was too relieved to be angry at that point. Dr. Chen was right. Within 3 weeks of starting the supplements and thyroid medication, my energy levels returned to normal. The joint pain disappeared almost entirely, and I was back to my usual schedule of client meetings, evening workouts, and weekend activities with Isabella. But as my health improved, my questions about Dr. Harrison multiplied. Why had he dismissed my symptoms so readily? Why had he claimed my insurance wouldn't cover tests that Dr. Chen ordered without hesitation? Why had a thorough, caring physician suddenly become dismissive and superficial in his care? I might have chalked it up to physician burnout or age-related changes in his practice style, but then Isabella shared something that made my blood run cold. Elena, you're not going to believe what happened at my appointment with Dr. Chen last week. We were having lunch at our favorite cafe, celebrating my return to normal energy levels and the successful launch of a new client project that I'd been too sick to complete for months. Dr. Chen asked me about our family medical history, and when I mentioned that you'd been seeing Dr. Harrison for over 20 years, she got this really strange look on her face. Strange how? She asked if you'd been happy with his care recently, and when I told her about how dismissive he'd been about your symptoms, she said something really weird. She said she'd been seeing a lot of patients lately who were switching from Dr. Harrison's practice, especially women over 50, and many of them had similar stories about symptoms being dismissed as normal aging. Isabella leaned forward, lowering her voice. Elena, she said she's reported several cases to the state medical board because patients came to her with serious conditions that should have been diagnosed months or years earlier. Conditions that Dr. Harrison had dismissed as age-related complaints. The cafe suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. I set down my coffee cup with trembling hands. What kind of conditions? Thyroid disorders like yours, vitamin deficiencies, autoimmune diseases, even early-stage cancers that were caught late because symptoms were attributed to menopause or normal aging instead of being properly investigated. I stared at my sister, trying to process what she was telling me. Dr. Harrison hadn't just dismissed my symptoms. He'd been systematically dismissing the symptoms of multiple patients, particularly older women, potentially endangering their health and lives. There's more, Isabella continued. Dr. Chen said she'd heard rumors about billing irregularities at Dr. Harrison's practice. Something about insurance claims for services that weren't actually provided, or claims for more expensive procedures when simpler ones were actually performed. Insurance fraud. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made me feel sick to my stomach. Dr. Harrison's sudden concern about insurance coverage, his dismissal of symptoms that would require diagnostic testing, his recent change in practice style, all of it could be explained by a scheme to maximize insurance billings while minimizing actual patient care. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the older patients I'd seen in Dr. Harrison's waiting room over the years. How many of them had been dismissed with explanations about normal aging when they actually had treatable conditions? How many had suffered unnecessarily because a doctor they trusted was more concerned with profit than proper care? I thought about Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman I'd often seen during my appointments who'd complained for months about fatigue, that Dr.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Harrison attributed to her age. She'd eventually stopped coming to the office altogether. Had she found another doctor, or had she simply given up on getting help? I thought about James Morrison, a man in his 60s who'd mentioned persistent cough and weight loss that Dr. Harrison had blamed on seasonal allergies and natural metabolism changes. I hadn't seen James in the waiting room for over a year. The possibilities of what might have happened to him were too frightening to contemplate. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I requested copies of all my medical records from Dr. Harrison's office. If there was fraud involved, I wanted to understand exactly what had been happening during my appointments and what kind of billing had been submitted to my insurance company. Getting the records proved to be more difficult than expected. Dr. Harrison's office claimed they needed 2 weeks to compile my files, then called to say there had been a delay due to technical issues with their records system. When I finally received the documents 3 weeks later, I understood why they'd been reluctant to release them. According to my medical records, I'd received extensive diagnostic testing during my March appointment. Blood work, urinalysis, EKG, and even a bone density scan. The insurance claims showed that Dr. Harrison had billed my insurance company over $2,800 for that single appointment. The reality was that I'd received a 10-minute physical examination and a prescription for ibuprofen. No tests had been performed, no additional diagnostics had been recommended, and certainly no bone density scan had been conducted. Harrison had billed my insurance for services that were never provided while simultaneously telling me that my insurance wouldn't cover the tests I actually needed. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the fraudulent billing records, feeling a cold rage building in my chest. This wasn't just medical malpractice, this was theft. Dr. Harrison had been stealing from insurance companies while denying proper care to his patients, and he'd been using age discrimination as a cover for his crimes. How many other patients had received similar treatment? How many people had been dismissed, denied care, and told their symptoms were just part of getting older while Dr. Harrison submitted false claims for expensive procedures he'd never performed? I called Dr. Chen's office and asked for an urgent appointment. When I showed her the fraudulent billing records, her expression shifted from concern to outright anger. "Miss Rodriguez, this is criminal fraud. You need to report this to your insurance company immediately, and I strongly recommend contacting the State Medical Board and the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division." The FBI, insurance fraud at this level is a federal crime. If Dr. Harrison has been doing this systematically across multiple patients, we're talking about millions of dollars in fraudulent claims. This could be one of the largest healthcare fraud schemes in Arizona history. That afternoon, I made a series of phone calls that would change everything. First to my insurance company's fraud hotline, then to the Arizona Medical Board, and finally to the FBI's Phoenix field office. Each conversation revealed that I wasn't the first person to report concerns about Dr. Harrison's practice. The insurance investigator, a woman named Agent Martinez, was particularly interested in my case because I had clear documentation of services that were billed but never provided. "Miss Rodriguez, we've been investigating Dr. Harrison's practice for 8 months. Your evidence could be the final piece we need to build a solid case for prosecution." 8 months, how long has this been going on? Based on our investigation, potentially years. We believe Dr. Harrison discovered that older patients were less likely to question their care or scrutinize their insurance statements. He's been systematically targeting patients over 50, dismissing their symptoms to avoid providing actual care while billing insurance companies for expensive procedures that were never performed. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Dr. Harrison had built his scheme around age discrimination, using societal biases about aging and older patients' tendency to trust their doctors without question to cover his tracks. He bet that older patients would accept dismissive treatment and wouldn't investigate discrepancies in their medical records or insurance claims. We estimate he's stolen over $2.3 million from various insurance companies over the past 4 years. But the financial fraud is only part of the damage. We're documenting cases where patients died or suffered serious complications because treatable conditions were dismissed as normal aging. Agent Martinez asked me to participate in a controlled confrontation with Dr. Harrison, wearing a recording device to capture his admissions about the fraudulent billing and substandard care. The FBI wanted to give him an opportunity to explain the discrepancies in my records and see how he responded when directly challenged with evidence of his crimes. 3 days later, I walked into Dr. Harrison's office for what I knew would be our final appointment. I was wearing a small recording device and carrying copies of my fraudulent billing records in my purse. The FBI had coached me on how to bring up the subject naturally and what questions to ask to elicit the most damaging admissions. Dr. Harrison greeted me with his usual professional demeanor, apparently unaware that his world was about to collapse around him. He looked exactly the same as always, distinguished, confident, completely in control of his environment. "Elena, how are you feeling? I trust the anti-inflammatory medication is helping with your symptoms." "Actually, Dr. Harrison, that's what I wanted to discuss with you. I sought a second opinion about my symptoms, and it turns out I had severe vitamin D deficiency and thyroid dysfunction. Very treatable conditions that should have been caught with basic blood work." His expression didn't change, but I noticed his hands tense slightly. "Well, I'm glad you're feeling better. Sometimes a fresh perspective can be helpful. The interesting thing is that my new doctor ordered the exact same tests you said my insurance wouldn't cover. But when I looked at my records from our last appointment, I see that you actually did bill my insurance for extensive blood work, along with several other tests that I don't remember having." Now his face went pale. Dr. Harrison was intelligent enough to recognize that he was being confronted with evidence of fraud, but apparently arrogant enough to believe he could talk his way out of it. "Elena, there might be some confusion about the billing codes. Sometimes administrative errors occur, and procedures get coded differently than how they're described to patients. So you're saying there was an administrative error when you billed my insurance $2,800 for tests that were never performed? I think there's been a misunderstanding about what tests were actually conducted. If you're concerned about billing issues, I'd be happy to have my office manager review your account." He was still trying to manipulate the situation, still treating me like a confused older patient who could be dismissed with vague explanations and bureaucratic deflection. But I wasn't the same woman who'd left his office in March feeling diminished and dismissed. "Dr. Harrison, I've been your patient for 23 years. I trusted you with my health, my concerns, and my life. Can you explain to me why you submitted insurance claims for a bone density scan that never happened? Why you billed for extensive blood work, while telling me my insurance wouldn't cover basic diagnostic tests?" For the first time in our decades-long relationship, Dr. Harrison looked genuinely rattled. The confident paternalistic physician facade was cracking, revealing something uglier underneath. "Elena, I think you're overreacting to what amounts to routine billing discrepancies. If you're unhappy with your care, perhaps it would be best if you found another physician." "Actually, I already have. Dr. Sarah Chen has been providing me with the kind of thorough, attentive care that I used to receive from you before you decided that patients my age weren't worth the effort. I resent the implication that age has anything to do with the quality of care I provide. Then how do you explain telling me that extensive testing wasn't cost-effective for someone my age, while simultaneously billing my insurance for those exact tests? How do you explain dismissing symptoms that turned out to be easily treatable conditions?" Dr. Harrison stood up abruptly, his professional mask finally slipping completely. "I think this appointment is over. If you have concerns about billing, you can contact my office manager. I won't sit here and be accused of impropriety by a patient who clearly doesn't understand the complexities of modern medical practice." "Oh, I understand perfectly. You've been using age discrimination to cover insurance fraud, dismissing older patients' symptoms to avoid providing care while billing for services you never performed. The question is whether you're going to take responsibility for what you've done or continue lying to cover your tracks." His face flushed red with anger and fear. "Elena, I strongly suggest you be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Defamation is a serious matter, and I won't hesitate to protect my reputation in practice." "Your reputation," I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Dr. Harrison, your reputation is about to become the least of your problems." I stood up and walked toward the door, then turned back to face him one final time. "By the way, the FBI has been investigating your practice for 8 months. They're very interested in patients like me who have clear documentation of billing fraud. You might want to call your lawyer." The look of absolute terror that crossed his face told me everything I needed to know. Dr. Harrison knew exactly what he'd been doing, knew exactly how many patients he'd defrauded and endangered, and knew exactly what the consequences would be when the full scope of his crimes came to light. I walked out of his office feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. True empowerment. Not the hollow corporate confidence I'd cultivated in my business life, but the deep satisfaction that comes from standing up to someone who has abused their power and holding them accountable for their actions. 3 weeks later, Dr. Harrison was arrested at his office in front of his staff and patients. The FBI had gathered enough evidence to charge him with healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, mail fraud, and racketeering. The investigation revealed that he'd systematically defrauded insurance companies of over $2.3 million while endangering the health of hundreds of patients through substandard care disguised as age-appropriate treatment. The local news coverage was extensive. Patient after patient came forward with stories of dismissed symptoms, delayed diagnoses, and fraudulent billing. Women in their 50s and 60s who'd been told their fatigue was just menopause when they actually had thyroid disease. Men in their 70s who'd been told their persistent cough was just aging when they had early-stage lung cancer. Elderly patients who'd been denied proper diagnostic workups, while Dr. Harrison billed their insurance for expensive tests he'd never performed. The Arizona Medical Board revoked his license permanently. His practice was shut down, his assets frozen to pay restitution to insurance companies and victims. Dr. Benjamin Harrison, who had once seemed like the epitome of medical professionalism, was facing 20 years in federal prison. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when I received a call from Agent Martinez at the FBI. Dr. Harrison had agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. He would serve 12 years in federal prison and pay full restitution to his victims. Rodriguez, I want you to know that your willingness to come forward and confront Dr. Harrison directly was crucial to building this case. Without your recorded confession and your documentation of the billing fraud, we might never have been able to prove the full scope of his crimes. I hung up the phone and sat in my living room, looking out at the Phoenix skyline and thinking about all the patients whose lives had been damaged by Dr. Harrison's greed and callousness. How many people had suffered unnecessarily because they trusted a doctor who saw them as nothing more than billing opportunities. But I also thought about the dozens of patients who had found proper care after Dr. Harrison's practice was shut down. Isabella had connected me with several women from her book club who'd been Dr. Harrison's patients, and all of them had found new physicians who actually listened to their concerns and provided appropriate treatment. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman I'd seen in Dr. Harrison's waiting room, had been diagnosed with severe anemia and started on treatment that restored her energy and quality of life. James Morrison, the man with the persistent cough, had been diagnosed with early-stage lung cancer that was successfully treated after Dr. Harrison was no longer in the picture to dismiss his symptoms. The ripple effects of holding one corrupt physician accountable had improved the lives of hundreds of people who might otherwise have continued suffering in silence, told that their symptoms were just part of getting older. Today, at 60, I'm healthier and more energetic than I was at 58. My thyroid levels are optimal, my vitamin D deficiency has been corrected, and I have a physician who treats me like an intelligent adult rather than a burden to be managed. Dr. Chen and I have developed the kind of collaborative relationship that healthcare should always be, based on mutual respect and genuine concern for my well-being. I've also become an advocate for older patients' rights, speaking at medical conferences about age discrimination in healthcare and the warning signs of potential fraud. The experience with Dr. Harrison taught me that accepting dismissive treatment as normal aging isn't just harmful to individual patients, it enables systemic abuse that can destroy lives. Sometimes Isabella asks me if I regret not figuring out what Dr. Harrison was doing sooner, if I feel guilty about the years I spent trusting him while he was defrauding insurance companies and neglecting his patients' health. The answer is complicated. I wish I'd recognized the warning signs earlier. I wish I'd questioned his sudden change in behavior and sought a second opinion months sooner. But I can't regret the ultimate outcome. Dr. Harrison's arrest and conviction probably saved lives, and it certainly improved the quality of life for dozens of patients who were finally able to get proper medical care. The most important lesson I learned is that getting older doesn't mean accepting substandard treatment or dismissive attitudes from healthcare providers. Age brings wisdom, experience, and the right to demand respect and appropriate care. When a doctor tells you that your symptoms are just part of getting older, that's often a red flag that should prompt you to seek a second opinion. Your health is worth fighting for, regardless of your age. Your symptoms deserve investigation, your concerns deserve attention, and your life has value that goes far beyond what appears on an insurance claim. Don't let anyone, especially someone in a position of medical authority, convince you otherwise. The price of trusting the wrong doctor can be devastating, but the reward for advocating for yourself and holding bad actors accountable can literally save lives. At 60, I'm just getting started. The morning after Dr. Harrison's arrest, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Word had spread quickly through Phoenix's medical community, and apparently my role in exposing the fraud scheme had become common knowledge. Some messages were supportive, praising me for having the courage to come forward. Others were less friendly. "You destroyed a good man's career over billing mistakes," read one text from a number I didn't recognize. "Dr. Harrison helped my family for 15 years. I hope you're proud of yourself." I sat in my kitchen with my coffee, scrolling through the messages and trying to process the mixed reactions. The supportive messages came mostly from women my age or older, patients who had experienced similar dismissive treatment from various doctors over the years. The critical messages seemed to come from younger patients and Dr. Harrison's professional colleagues, people who had apparently never experienced the systematic age discrimination that had been central to his fraud scheme. Isabella arrived at my house around 9 in the morning, bringing pastries from our favorite bakery and a stack of newspapers. The story had made the front page of the Arizona Republic, and Dr. Harrison's arrest was the lead story on 3 local news websites. "Elena, you need to see this," she said, spreading the newspapers across my kitchen table. The headlines were dramatic: "Prominent Phoenix doctor arrested in $2.3 million fraud scheme, age discrimination used to cover healthcare fraud, patient's trust betrayed by respected physician." But it was the online comments sections that really caught my attention. Hundreds of people had shared their own experiences with Dr. Harrison and other physicians who had dismissed their health concerns based on age. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. Women over 50 being told their symptoms were hormonal or stress-related without proper investigation. Men over 60 having chest pain attributed to anxiety instead of cardiac issues. Elderly patients being prescribed pain medication instead of receiving diagnostic workups for treatable conditions. "Look at this one," Isabella said, pointing to a comment from someone named Margaret Thompson. She says Dr. Harrison told her that fatigue and weight loss were normal for a woman her age. She finally saw another doctor who diagnosed her with diabetes. She'd been suffering for 2 years with a completely manageable condition. As we read through the comments, a disturbing picture emerged. Dr. Harrison's fraud scheme hadn't been limited to billing for services he didn't provide. He'd also been systematically undertreating his older patients, prescribing expensive medications instead of conducting proper diagnostic workups, and referring patients to specialists he had financial relationships with rather than the most qualified providers. "Elena, there's something else you need to know," Isabella said, her voice suddenly serious. "I got a call this morning from someone at the FBI. Agent Martinez wants to meet with both of us this afternoon." My stomach dropped. "Both of us? Why would they want to talk to you?" "Because I was Dr. Harrison's patient too, and apparently my medical records show some of the same billing irregularities that yours did. They think the fraud scheme was much larger than what they initially uncovered." Agent Martinez met us at a coffee shop in Central Phoenix, away from the FBI field office to avoid attracting media attention. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of focused intensity that made me understand why she was effective at investigating healthcare fraud. "Miss Rodriguez, Miss Rivera, thank you for meeting with me. The investigation into Dr. Harrison's practice has expanded significantly since his arrest, and we need your help understanding the full scope of what was happening." She spread several documents across our table, including what appeared to be financial records and patient billing summaries. "Based on our analysis of Dr. Harrison's billing patterns over the past 5 years, we believe he defrauded insurance companies of considerably more than the $2.3 million we initially calculated. We're now looking at potential fraud exceeding $4.8 million. Isabella and I exchanged glances. The numbers were staggering, but what was more disturbing was the implication that hundreds of patients had been affected by Dr. Harrison's scheme. "The pattern we're seeing is sophisticated and deliberate," Agent Martinez continued. Dr. Harrison specifically targeted patients over 50, particularly women, because research shows they're less likely to question their doctor's recommendations or scrutinize their insurance statements. He then used age discrimination as a cover for providing substandard care while billing for expensive procedures and tests. She showed us a chart that tracked Dr. Harrison's billing patterns over time. The fraud had started small about 6 years earlier, with occasional false claims for minor procedures. But it had escalated dramatically over the past 3 years, coinciding with changes in his practice's financial situation. Dr. Harrison was facing significant personal and professional financial pressures, Agent Martinez explained. His practice had invested heavily in expensive equipment that wasn't generating the expected revenue. He was also going through an expensive divorce and had accumulated substantial gambling debts. The gambling debts were news to me. During all my years as Dr. Harrison's patient, he had projected an image of financial success and professional stability. His office was expensive, his manner confident, his lifestyle apparently comfortable. I'd never suspected that he might be struggling with addiction or financial problems. The fraud scheme was his solution to multiple problems, Agent Martinez continued. He could generate revenue through false billing while reducing his actual workload by providing minimal care to patients he viewed as unlikely to complain or seek second opinions. Isabella leaned forward, her face pale. Agent Martinez, are you saying he deliberately provided bad medical care to older patients because he thought we wouldn't fight back? That's exactly what I'm saying. Dr. Harrison's scheme depended on age-related stereotypes and biases. He counted on older patients accepting dismissive treatment as normal, and unfortunately he was right most of the time. The conversation continued for 2 hours as Agent Martinez explained the broader implications of the case. Dr. Harrison's arrest had prompted other patients to come forward with their own experiences, and federal investigators were now looking into similar schemes at medical practices across Arizona and other states. Healthcare fraud targeting older patients is becoming increasingly common, she told us. Physicians know that Medicare and insurance companies pay well for diagnostic procedures, but they also know that older patients are often reluctant to question their doctors or advocate aggressively for their own care. As we prepared to leave, Agent Martinez handed me a business card. Miss Rodriguez, we'd like you to consider testifying at Dr. Harrison's sentencing hearing. Your willingness to confront him directly and document his fraudulent billing was crucial to building this case, and your testimony could help ensure he receives an appropriate sentence. Testifying at the sentencing hearing meant publicly describing my experience as Dr. Harrison's victim, detailing how his age discrimination had affected my health and well-being, and explaining the broader implications of his fraud scheme. The thought of speaking in a federal courtroom was intimidating, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I'll testify, I said. If it helps prevent other patients from going through what I experienced, I'll do whatever you need. Over the following weeks, the scope of Dr. Harrison's fraud became even clearer. The FBI investigation revealed that he had billed insurance companies for over 3,000 procedures that were never performed, affecting more than 800 patients over a 5-year period. The average fraudulent billing per patient was over $6,000, representing everything from blood tests and imaging studies to cardiac procedures and cancer screenings that existed only on paper. But the financial fraud was only part of the damage. As more patients came forward with their stories, it became clear that Dr. Harrison's systematic neglect had caused serious harm to people's health and quality of life. Martha Williams, a 67-year-old retired teacher, had complained to Dr. Harrison about persistent abdominal pain for over a year. He had attributed her symptoms to normal aging and stress, prescribing antacids and telling her to reduce her activity level. When she finally sought a second opinion after Dr. Harrison's arrest, she was diagnosed with gallbladder disease that required emergency surgery. The condition could have been easily treated with outpatient surgery if it had been diagnosed when she first reported symptoms. Robert Chen, a 71-year-old engineer, had mentioned concerning changes in his vision during routine appointments with Dr. Harrison. Instead of referring him to an ophthalmologist, Dr. Harrison had dismissed the symptoms as normal age-related changes and suggested over-the-counter reading glasses. Robert was later diagnosed with glaucoma that had progressed to the point where he had lost significant vision in both eyes. With early detection and treatment, his vision could have been preserved. The stories multiplied as the investigation continued. Dozens of patients who had accepted Dr. Harrison's dismissive explanations for their symptoms discovered they had serious treatable conditions that had been ignored or misdiagnosed. Some had suffered permanent damage because proper treatment was delayed. Others had endured months or years of unnecessary pain and disability. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Many of Dr. Harrison's victims described feeling gaslit and dismissed, told that their symptoms were imaginary or exaggerated when they were actually experiencing real serious health problems. The experience had undermined their confidence in the medical system and their ability to advocate for their own health care. I found myself becoming an unofficial spokesperson for Dr. Harrison's victims, fielding calls from journalists and other patients who wanted to share their experiences. The local news stations interviewed me several times about the case, and I began speaking at medical conferences about the warning signs of healthcare fraud and age discrimination. One of the most difficult conversations I had was with Dr. Harrison's former nurse Kelly, who had worked in his practice for 8 years. She reached out to me 3 weeks after his arrest, asking if we could meet for coffee. Kelly was a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and the sort of gentle demeanor that probably made her very good at her job. But when we met, she looked exhausted and haunted, like someone carrying a heavy burden of guilt and regret. "Miss Rodriguez, I need to apologize to you and to all of Dr. Harrison's patients," she began, her voice shaking. I knew something was wrong with the way he was treating his older patients, but I didn't know how to stop it. She explained that she had noticed changes in Dr. Harrison's practice patterns over the past few years. He had become increasingly dismissive with older patients, spending less time on examinations and more time on billing documentation. He had also begun pressuring her to code procedures and office visits in ways that maximized insurance reimbursement. He told me that older patients didn't need as much attention because their problems were mostly age-related and couldn't be fixed anyway. Kelly said, tears streaming down her face. I knew that wasn't right, but he was the doctor and I was just a nurse. I thought maybe I was wrong to question his medical judgment. Kelly had tried to advocate for patients when she could, suggesting that certain symptoms might warrant additional testing or specialist referrals. But Dr. Harrison had made it clear that such suggestions were unwelcome and could cost her her job. I should have reported him to the medical board or found another way to help his patients, she said. I'll never forgive myself for staying silent while he harmed so many people. I felt a complicated mix of anger and sympathy listening to Kelly's story. She had been in a difficult position, caught between her professional obligations and her economic need to keep her job. But her silence had enabled Dr. Harrison's fraud scheme to continue for years, affecting hundreds of patients who might have received proper care if she had spoken up sooner. Kelly, what's done is done, I told her. But you can still help by testifying about what you witnessed in Dr. Harrison's practice. Your testimony could be crucial in helping other victims get justice and preventing similar fraud in the future. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I've already talked to the FBI, and I'll testify at his trial. It's the least I can do to try to make amends for my silence. The conversation with Kelly reinforced my growing understanding of how healthcare fraud schemes depend on institutional cultures that discourage questioning authority or speaking up about problematic practices. Dr. Harrison had created an environment where staff members felt unable to advocate for patients, even when they suspected something was wrong. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about Dr. Harrison's systematic approach to defrauding insurance companies and neglecting his patients. Federal prosecutors revealed that he had kept detailed notes about which patients were most likely to accept dismissive treatment without seeking second opinions. Older women, particularly those without strong family support systems, were specifically targeted for minimal care and maximal billing. The prosecution team also discovered that Dr. Harrison had been sharing information about his fraud techniques with other physicians at medical conferences and through online forums. He had essentially been teaching other doctors how to use age discrimination as a cover for insurance fraud, spreading his corrupt practices throughout the medical community. Dr. Harrison didn't just commit fraud, prosecutor Janet Foster explained to me during one of our preparation sessions for the sentencing hearing. He was actively corrupting other physicians and spreading harmful practices that could affect thousands of additional patients. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Harrison had successfully taught his fraud techniques to even a dozen other physicians, the total number of affected patients could be in the thousands and the financial damage could exceed tens of millions of dollars. As Dr. Harrison's sentencing hearing approached, I spent considerable time preparing my victim impact statement. I wanted to convey not just the personal harm I had experienced, but the broader societal damage caused by his fraud scheme and the systemic age discrimination it represented. I also connected with other victims who would be testifying at the hearing. Margaret Thompson, the woman whose diabetes had been misdiagnosed as normal aging, had suffered serious complications that could have been prevented with proper treatment. James Wilson, a 68-year-old veteran, had endured months of cardiac symptoms that Dr. Harrison dismissed as anxiety before another physician diagnosed him with significant heart disease requiring surgery. Each victim had a story of being dismissed, diminished, and denied proper medical care because Dr. Harrison viewed them as convenient targets for his fraud scheme. The psychological damage was often as severe as the physical harm, with many patients describing lasting trauma from being gaslit and manipulated by someone they had trusted with their lives. The day before the sentencing hearing, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Harrison's defense attorney. He wanted to know if I would consider meeting with Dr. Harrison to hear his apology and discuss a potential victim compensation agreement. My client deeply regrets his actions and would like the opportunity to apologize to you personally, the attorney explained. He's prepared to offer substantial compensation for the harm you experienced, and he hopes that a face-to-face meeting might provide some closure for both of you. The request caught me completely off guard. After months of viewing Dr. Harrison as a criminal who had betrayed my trust and endangered my health, the idea of meeting with him again seemed surreal. But part of me was curious about what he might say, what explanation he might offer for his systematic betrayal of his patient's trust. I'll consider it, I told the attorney. But any meeting would have to be on my terms, and I won't agree to any compensation that requires me to modify my testimony or minimize the harm he caused. That night, I discussed the meeting request with Isabella and Dr. Chen, both of whom had become important advisors during this difficult process. Isabella was skeptical about Dr. Harrison's motives, suspecting that the apology was just another manipulation designed to reduce his sentence. Dr. Chen was more open to the possibility that genuine remorse might motivate someone to seek forgiveness from their victims. Elena, you don't owe him anything, Isabella said. He had years to apologize for his behavior before he was caught and arrested. Why should you give him the satisfaction of forgiveness now? Dr. Chen had a different perspective. Sometimes facing your victims and acknowledging the harm you've caused is an important part of taking responsibility for criminal behavior. If Dr. Harrison is genuinely remorseful, meeting with him might provide valuable closure for both of you. Ultimately, I decided to meet with Dr. Harrison, not because I felt any obligation to forgive him, but because I wanted to look him in the eye and tell him exactly how his fraud scheme had affected my life and the lives of hundreds of other patients. The meeting was arranged for the morning of the sentencing hearing, in a conference room at the federal courthouse with both attorneys present. When Dr. Harrison walked into the room, I was struck by how much he had changed since his arrest. The confident, distinguished physician I had known for over 20 years had been replaced by a man who looked older, smaller, and deeply defeated. He was wearing an expensive suit, but it hung loosely on his frame, as if he had lost significant weight during the months since his arrest. His hair, which had always been perfectly styled, looked unkempt and gray. Most significantly, the authoritative presence that had defined his professional persona was completely gone. He looked like a broken man facing the consequences of his own choices. Elena, thank you for agreeing to meet with me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know how deeply I regret what I did to you and to all of my patients. I looked at him across the conference table, remembering all the times I had sat in his office trusting his medical judgment and believing he had my best interests at heart. The contrast between the confident physician who had dismissed my symptoms and the defeated man sitting before me was almost jarring. Dr. Harrison, I'm not here to forgive you, I said calmly. I'm here to make sure you understand the full extent of the harm you caused, not just to me, but to hundreds of patients who trusted you with their health and their lives. He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. I know I destroyed that trust, and I know the damage I caused can never be fully repaired. The gambling addiction and financial pressures don't excuse what I did, but I want you to understand that I never intended to hurt anyone. But you did hurt people, I replied. You systematically targeted older patients because you thought we would be easier to manipulate and less likely to question your authority. You used our age and our trust against us to cover your crimes. Dr. Harrison broke down completely, sobbing as he acknowledged the calculated nature of his fraud scheme. You're right, I told myself I was just cutting corners, providing adequate care while maximizing revenue. But the truth is I was stealing from insurance companies and neglecting my patients because I thought I could get away with it. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Dr. Harrison acknowledging specific details about his fraud scheme and the systematic way he had targeted vulnerable patients. His attorney looked increasingly uncomfortable as his client made admissions that could potentially increase his sentence, but Dr. Harrison seemed compelled to confess the full scope of his crimes. Elena, I want you to know that your willingness to confront me and expose what I was doing probably saved lives, he said, as our meeting concluded. If you hadn't spoken up, I would have continued harming patients indefinitely. I left the meeting feeling emotionally drained, but also oddly satisfied. Seeing Dr. Harrison broken and remorseful didn't erase the harm he had caused, but it provided a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. He was no longer the intimidating authority figure who had dismissed my health concerns. He was just a man who had made terrible choices and would spend the next 12 years in prison paying for them. The sentencing hearing that afternoon was packed with Dr. Harrison's victims, federal investigators, journalists, and members of the medical community. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the proceeding with the kind of grave dignity appropriate for such a serious case. One by one, Dr. Harrison's victims testified about the harm they had experienced. Margaret Thompson described the diabetic complications that could have been prevented with proper diagnosis. James Wilson talked about the cardiac surgery he had needed after months of delayed treatment. Martha Williams explained how her untreated gallbladder disease had nearly killed her. When my turn came to testify, I felt a strange sense of calm. After months of preparation and emotional processing, I was ready to tell my story and explain the broader implications of Dr. Harrison's crimes. Your Honor, Dr. Harrison didn't just commit financial fraud, I began. He weaponized age discrimination to cover his crimes, systematically targeting older patients because he believed we would accept substandard care without question. His scheme depended on societal biases about aging and older people's supposed unwillingness to advocate for themselves. I described my own experience with Dr. Harrison's dismissive treatment and fraudulent billing, but I also emphasized the broader impact of his crimes on the medical community and society's trust in healthcare providers. Harrison's fraud scheme has damaged not just his direct victims, but the relationship between older patients and the entire medical system, I continued. His actions have made it harder for legitimate physicians to build trust with their older patients, and they have reinforced harmful stereotypes about aging that affect healthcare delivery across the country. Judge Williams listened intently to each victim's testimony, taking notes and asking occasional clarifying questions. When all the victims had spoken, she asked Dr. Harrison if he wanted to address the court before sentencing. Harrison stood slowly, looking directly at the victims seated in the courtroom gallery. Your Honor, and to all of my former patients, I am deeply sorry for the harm I have caused. I betrayed the trust you placed in me, and I violated the most fundamental principles of medical practice. I have no excuse for my actions, and I accept full responsibility for the consequences. He spoke for several more minutes, acknowledging specific victims and expressing remorse for the systematic nature of his fraud scheme. But even his apparent sincerity couldn't undo the damage he had caused or restore the trust he had destroyed. Judge Williams deliberated for nearly 30 minutes before announcing Dr. Harrison's sentence: 12 years in federal prison, full restitution to insurance companies and victims, permanent loss of medical license, and 5 years of supervised probation after his release. Dr. Harrison, you systematically abused your position of trust and authority to defraud insurance companies and endanger your patients' health, Judge Williams said. Your crimes were particularly egregious because they targeted vulnerable older patients who relied on your expertise and integrity. The sentence I am imposing reflects the seriousness of your crimes and the need to deter similar conduct by other healthcare providers. As Dr. Harrison was led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the damage he had caused would take years to fully address. Hundreds of patients would need to rebuild their trust in the medical system, and the broader healthcare community would need to examine how systematic fraud and age discrimination could flourish undetected for so long. After the sentencing hearing, I was approached by several journalists and advocacy groups who wanted to discuss the broader implications of Dr. Harrison's case. The story had attracted national attention as an example of healthcare fraud targeting older patients, and there was growing interest in preventing similar schemes in the future. Over the following months, I found myself becoming an unexpected advocate for older patients' rights and healthcare fraud prevention. I spoke at medical conferences, testified before state legislative committees, and worked with advocacy groups to develop educational materials about recognizing and reporting healthcare fraud. The experience had transformed me from a passive patient who trusted her doctor without question into an informed advocate who understood the importance of questioning authority and demanding appropriate care. It was a transformation I never would have chosen, but one that ultimately empowered me to help other patients avoid similar exploitation. Dr. Harrison's case also prompted broader changes in the healthcare system. Insurance companies implemented new fraud detection systems specifically designed to identify suspicious billing patterns targeting older patients. Medical boards strengthened their oversight procedures and created new channels for reporting age discrimination and substandard care. Professional medical organizations developed training programs to help physicians recognize and address their own biases about aging and older patients. But perhaps the most important change was in how older patients approached their own healthcare. Dr. Harrison's case became a cautionary tale that encouraged patients to question dismissive treatment, seek second opinions, and demand appropriate diagnostic workups, regardless of their age. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized that exposing Dr. Harrison's fraud scheme had been about more than just individual justice. It had been about challenging a system that allowed vulnerable patients to be exploited and ensuring that age would never again be used as an excuse for substandard medical care. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in months, I felt hopeful about the future of healthcare for older patients. Dr. Harrison's crimes had caused tremendous harm, but they had also sparked a movement toward greater accountability, transparency, and respect for patients of all ages. 6 months after Dr. Harrison's sentencing, I was sitting in my home office when the phone rang with a call that would change my understanding of just how deep the corruption in healthcare could run. The caller identified herself as Dr. Linda Vasquez, Chief Medical Officer for Sunrise Health Partners, one of Arizona's largest medical groups. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm calling because we need your help with a very sensitive investigation. We have reason to believe that Dr. Harrison's fraud scheme was part of a much larger network of physicians engaging in similar practices across multiple states. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had assumed that Dr. Harrison was an isolated case, a single corrupt physician whose crimes had been exposed and punished. The possibility that his fraud scheme was connected to a broader network of criminal activity was both shocking and terrifying. Dr. Vasquez, what exactly are you saying? Are you telling me there are other doctors doing what Dr. Harrison did? We believe so. Over the past several months, we've been contacted by insurance companies, federal investigators, and medical boards from 6 different states reporting similar patterns of fraud targeting older patients. The billing schemes, the patient targeting methods, even the specific language used to dismiss symptoms all show remarkable similarities to what Dr. Harrison was doing. She explained that Sunrise Health Partners had been conducting an internal investigation after several of their affiliated physicians came under scrutiny for billing irregularities. What they discovered was a sophisticated network of healthcare providers who had been sharing fraud techniques and coordinating their schemes to avoid detection. Ms. Rodriguez, your willingness to come forward about Dr. Harrison's crimes started a chain reaction that's now exposing what may be the largest healthcare fraud conspiracy in American history. We're talking about potentially hundreds of physicians and billions of dollars in fraudulent claims. The scope of what Dr. Vasquez was describing was almost incomprehensible. If Dr. Harrison had been part of a national network of fraudulent physicians, the number of affected patients could be in the tens of thousands. The financial damage could exceed anything previously seen in healthcare fraud cases. What do you need from me? I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. We need you to testify before a federal grand jury about your experiences with Dr. Harrison and help us identify potential connections between his scheme and similar operations in other states. Your expertise in recognizing the warning signs of this type of fraud could be crucial to building cases against the other physicians involved. The conversation with Dr. Vasquez lasted nearly 2 hours as she outlined the scope of the federal investigation and the role they wanted me to play. The Department of Justice had assembled a task force specifically focused on healthcare fraud targeting older patients, and they were using Dr. Harrison's case as a model for understanding how these schemes operated. The perpetrators specifically target patients over 50 because research shows they're more likely to trust authority figures and less likely to question their medical care, Dr. Vasquez explained. They use age discrimination as both a cover for their crimes and a method of victim selection. She showed me documents from physicians' practices in Texas, Florida, Nevada, California, Oregon, and Montana that showed billing patterns nearly identical to what Dr. Harrison had been doing. False claims for diagnostic procedures, systematic dismissal of older patients' symptoms, and coordinated efforts to avoid detection by insurance fraud investigators. Dr. Harrison wasn't working alone, and he wasn't the mastermind behind this scheme. He was part of a network that included dozens of physicians, practice administrators, billing companies, and even some insurance company employees who helped the schemes avoid detection. The revelation that insurance company employees might be involved in the fraud was particularly disturbing. If the very people responsible for detecting and preventing healthcare fraud were actually facilitating it, the corruption was far deeper than anyone had imagined. After my conversation with Dr. Vasquez, I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being uncovered. What had started as my personal fight for justice against one corrupt physician was now part of a federal investigation into a nationwide conspiracy that had potentially affected thousands of patients. Isabella came over that evening to help me process what I had learned. She brought Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine, sensing that I needed both comfort food and emotional support to deal with the new information. Elena, I know this is a lot to take in, but you have to understand how important your role has been in exposing all of this, she said, as we sat in my living room with our dinner. If you hadn't been brave enough to confront Dr. Harrison and document his fraud, none of these other cases might ever have come to light. But Isabella, we're talking about potentially thousands of patients who were harmed while I was just focusing on my own case. How many people suffered because this network was allowed to operate for years? You can't blame yourself for crimes that other people committed. You did what you could with the information you had, and now you're helping to expose a much larger problem. That's something to be proud of, not guilty about. The next morning, I received a call from Agent Martinez at the FBI asking me to come in for a briefing about the expanded investigation. The federal task force had been working around the clock for months, following leads that connected Dr. Harrison's scheme to similar operations across the country. Ms. Rodriguez, we need to prepare you for what you're going to hear in this briefing, Agent Martinez said as we walked through the halls of the FBI field office. The scope of this conspiracy is unlike anything we've seen in healthcare fraud before. The briefing room was filled with federal agents, prosecutors, medical investigators, and insurance fraud specialists from multiple agencies. The walls were covered with charts, maps, and photographs showing connections between various physicians and medical practices involved in the fraud network. Special Agent William Chen, who was leading the task force, began the presentation with an overview of what they had discovered. Ladies and gentlemen, we are dealing with a criminal conspiracy that spans at least 12 states and involves more than 200 healthcare providers. The total financial fraud exceeds $50 million, and the number of affected patients is estimated at over 15,000. The numbers were staggering, but what was even more disturbing was the systematic nature of the conspiracy. The fraudulent physicians had been organized into regional networks, sharing techniques for avoiding detection and coordinating their schemes to maximize revenue while minimizing risk. The conspiracy was organized around a series of training seminars and online forums where physicians learned how to implement age discriminatory practices as a cover for billing fraud, Agent Chen continued. Harrison was one of the early adopters of these techniques, and his successes made him a mentor for other physicians looking to increase their revenue through fraudulent means. The presentation included recorded phone calls between Dr. Harrison and other physicians where they discussed strategies for dismissing older patients' symptoms and maximizing insurance billings. The conversations were chilling in their casual discussion of patient exploitation and systematic fraud. In one recording, Dr. Harrison could be heard advising a physician in Nevada about how to handle patients who questioned their treatment. "You have to remember that older patients generally defer to authority. If you're confident and dismissive, most of them will accept whatever you tell them. The key is to make them feel like they're being unreasonable for questioning your medical judgment." Another recording captured Dr. Harrison explaining billing strategies to a group of physicians at a medical conference. The beauty of targeting older patients is that they rarely scrutinize their insurance statements or question billing discrepancies. You can bill for extensive diagnostic workups while providing minimal actual care, and the patients will never know the difference. The recordings made it clear that Dr. Harrison hadn't just been a participant in the fraud network, he had been an active teacher and promoter of techniques for exploiting older patients. His influence had spread the corruption far beyond his own practice, affecting thousands of patients across the country. Agent Chen then introduced me to Dr. Patricia Kim, a forensic accountant who had been analyzing the financial aspects of the conspiracy. Dr. Kim had discovered that the fraudulent physicians had been using sophisticated money laundering techniques to hide their illegal profits and avoid detection by banking regulators. The physicians involved in this conspiracy weren't just stealing from insurance companies. Dr. Kim explained, they were using the fraudulent revenue to fund lavish lifestyles, gambling habits, and other criminal activities. "We've traced over $12 million in fraud proceeds to offshore accounts, luxury real estate purchases, and high-stakes gambling operations." The revelation that Dr. Harrison's gambling addiction had been funded by patient exploitation added another layer of betrayal to his crimes. Every fraudulent billing claim represented not just financial theft, but the systematic denial of proper medical care to vulnerable patients. As the briefing continued, I learned about the sophisticated methods the conspiracy had used to avoid detection. The physicians had developed techniques for spreading their fraudulent billing across multiple insurance companies to avoid triggering fraud detection algorithms. They had also coordinated their schemes to ensure that no single practice showed billing patterns unusual enough to attract regulatory attention. The conspiracy also included several employees of major insurance companies who provided inside information about fraud detection methods and helped the physicians modify their schemes to avoid scrutiny. Agent Chen revealed, "We're dealing with corruption that reaches into the very organizations responsible for preventing healthcare fraud." The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. Not only were hundreds of physicians systematically defrauding insurance companies and neglecting their patients, but they were receiving help from inside the insurance industry itself. After the briefing, I was introduced to several other victims of the fraud conspiracy who had agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar to my own experience with Dr. Harrison, but the cumulative impact of hearing so many accounts of medical betrayal was overwhelming. Sarah Mitchell, a 62-year-old retired librarian from Las Vegas, had been a patient of Dr. Robert Torres, one of Dr. Harrison's associates in the fraud network. Dr. Torres had dismissed her complaints about persistent fatigue and joint pain as normal aging while billing her insurance company for extensive cardiac testing that was never performed. Sarah later discovered she had severe rheumatoid arthritis that could have been effectively treated if diagnosed properly. Michael Davidson, a 68-year-old veteran from Portland, had been treated by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, another physician connected to the conspiracy. Dr. Walsh had attributed his respiratory symptoms to aging and stress while billing for lung function tests and chest imaging that never occurred. Michael was eventually diagnosed with lung cancer that had progressed to an advanced stage because of the delayed diagnosis. Story after story revealed the same pattern of age discrimination used to cover systematic fraud and patient neglect. The physicians involved in the conspiracy had weaponized societal biases about aging to exploit vulnerable patients while stealing millions of dollars from insurance companies. One of the most disturbing aspects of the conspiracy was how the fraudulent physicians had shared information about successful victim targeting. They had developed profiles of patients most likely to accept dismissive treatment and least likely to question billing irregularities. Older women living alone, patients with limited family support, and individuals with complex medical histories were specifically targeted for exploitation. The conspiracy members maintained detailed databases of patient characteristics that made them ideal targets for fraud, explained FBI analyst Rebecca Torres during one of our preparation sessions. They shared this information across the network to help other physicians identify vulnerable patients in their own practices. The systematic nature of the patient targeting was particularly chilling. These weren't crimes of opportunity committed by individual physicians facing financial pressure. This was organized, premeditated exploitation of vulnerable patients on a massive scale. As my involvement in the federal investigation deepened, I began receiving threatening communications from unknown sources. The messages started as anonymous emails questioning my motives for cooperating with federal investigators and gradually escalated to more explicit threats about the consequences of my testimony. "You're destroying innocent physicians' careers over billing mistakes," read one email that arrived in my inbox late one evening. "Dr. Harrison made errors in judgment, but he doesn't deserve to have his life ruined by a vindictive patient looking for attention." Other messages were more direct in their threats. "Stop talking to the FBI or you'll regret it. Mind your own business before something bad happens to you. Rich old ladies like you need to learn to keep their mouths shut." I reported the threatening communications to Agent Martinez, who took them very seriously. The FBI assigned protective surveillance to my home and warned me to be careful about my daily routines and social media activity. "Ms. Rodriguez, these threats indicate that the conspiracy members are becoming desperate," Agent Martinez explained during one of our security briefings. "The federal investigation is getting close to exposing the full scope of their crimes, and they're trying to intimidate witnesses to prevent further cooperation." The protective measures were both reassuring and frightening. Knowing that federal agents were monitoring my safety made me feel more secure, but the need for such protection was a constant reminder of how dangerous the situation had become. Isabella was particularly worried about my safety and urged me to consider stepping back from the investigation until the threats could be addressed. "Elena, you've already done more than enough to expose this corruption. Maybe it's time to let the federal agents handle the rest without putting yourself at risk." But I felt a responsibility to see the investigation through to its conclusion. Too many patients had been harmed by the fraud conspiracy for me to withdraw my cooperation when it might be most needed. "Isabella, if I stop cooperating with the investigation because of threats, it sends a message that intimidation works. How many other witnesses might decide not to come forward if they see that threats can silence victims?" The federal investigation continued to expand as more evidence of the conspiracy emerged. Investigators discovered that the fraudulent physicians had been using encrypted communication systems to coordinate their schemes and share information about successful fraud techniques. They had also been using shell companies and offshore accounts to launder their illegal profits and avoid taxation. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when federal agents arrested Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician in California, who appeared to be one of the regional coordinators for the fraud network. Dr. Webb had been responsible for recruiting new physicians into the conspiracy and training them in the techniques for exploiting older patients. Under interrogation, Dr. Webb revealed that the conspiracy had been organized by a group of physicians who had met at medical conferences focused on practice management and revenue optimization. What had started as informal discussions about maximizing insurance reimbursements had evolved into a criminal enterprise dedicated to systematic fraud. Dr. Webb has provided us with detailed information about the conspiracy's organizational structure and the identities of dozens of physicians involved in the scheme. Agent Chen informed me during one of our regular briefings. His cooperation is allowing us to build cases against the entire network rather than just individual participants. The information from Dr. Webb also revealed that the conspiracy had been planning to expand into new areas of healthcare fraud, including prescription drug schemes and Medicare fraud targeting elderly patients in nursing homes. The greed and ambition of the conspirators apparently knew no bounds. As the federal investigation progressed, I found myself becoming increasingly involved in efforts to reform the healthcare system to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. I testified before congressional committees about the need for stronger fraud detection systems and better protection for older patients against medical exploitation. During one particularly memorable hearing before the House Subcommittee on Health, I was asked to explain how age discrimination had facilitated the fraud conspiracy. Congressmen, the physicians involved in the scheme, understood that our society often dismisses older people's concerns and attributes their symptoms to inevitable aging. They exploited these biases to avoid providing proper medical care while stealing millions of dollars from insurance companies. The congressional testimony was broadcast on C-SPAN and later picked up by major news networks, giving me a platform to educate the public about the warning signs of healthcare fraud and the importance of advocating for appropriate medical care regardless of age. I also began working with medical schools to develop training programs that would help future physicians recognize and address their own biases about aging in older patients. The goal was to create a generation of healthcare providers who understood that age discrimination was not only morally wrong but could also facilitate criminal exploitation of vulnerable patients. One of the most rewarding aspects of this advocacy work was meeting with groups of older patients who had become more assertive about their healthcare as a result of learning about the fraud conspiracy. Many described feeling empowered to question their physicians' recommendations and seek second opinions when they felt their concerns were being dismissed. Ms. Rodriguez, your willingness to speak out about what happened to you has changed how I approach my own healthcare, said Dorothy Williams, a 74-year-old woman who attended one of my speaking engagements at a senior center in Phoenix. I used to just accept whatever my doctor told me, but now I ask questions and demand explanations. I even switched doctors when my previous physician seemed dismissive about my concerns. Stories like Dorothy's reinforced my belief that exposing the fraud conspiracy had been about more than just individual justice. It had been about changing the fundamental dynamics between older patients and the healthcare system to ensure that age would never again be used as an excuse for substandard care or criminal exploitation. The federal investigation reached a major milestone when prosecutors announced the indictment of 47 physicians, 12 practice administrators, 8 billing company employees, and 3 insurance company workers on charges related to the healthcare fraud conspiracy. The indictments represented the largest healthcare fraud case in Department of Justice history, with total alleged losses exceeding $75 million. Dr. Harrison's cooperation with the investigation had been crucial to building cases against the other conspiracy members. His detailed testimony about the network's operations and his willingness to identify other participants had helped prosecutors understand the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Dr. Harrison's decision to cooperate fully with our investigation demonstrates that even those who commit serious crimes can take responsibility for their actions and help prevent further harm to victims, explained U.S. Attorney David Morrison during the press conference announcing the indictments. The cooperation had also resulted in a reduced sentence for Dr. Harrison, though he would still serve 8 years in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy. Some victims felt that the sentence reduction was too lenient, but I understood that his cooperation had been essential to exposing the broader network and preventing continued harm to patients. As the individual trials of the conspiracy members began, I found myself testifying repeatedly about the impact of age-discriminatory healthcare practices and the systematic nature of the fraud schemes. Each trial revealed additional details about how the conspiracy had operated and the sophisticated methods used to exploit vulnerable patients. The trial of Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the physician who had delayed Michael Davidson's lung cancer diagnosis, was particularly emotional. Michael testified about how Dr. Walsh's dismissive treatment had cost him months of potential treatment time and possibly shortened his life expectancy. Dr. Walsh looked me in the eye and told me that my symptoms were just part of getting older, Michael said during his testimony. She made me feel like I was being unreasonable for wanting additional testing, Meanwhile, she was billing my insurance company for expensive procedures that never happened and denying me the medical care that could have saved my life. Walsh was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of healthcare fraud and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Her conviction, along with those of dozens of other conspiracy members, sent a clear message that healthcare fraud targeting older patients would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The trials also revealed the personal costs of the conspiracy for the physicians involved. Many had lost their medical licenses, their practices, their homes, and their families as a result of their criminal activities. The greed that had motivated their participation in the fraud network had ultimately destroyed everything they claimed to value. During the trial of Dr. Marcus Webb, the California physician who had helped coordinate the conspiracy, his ex-wife testified about how his involvement in the fraud scheme had changed him from a caring physician into someone obsessed with money and status. Marcus used to talk about helping patients and making a difference in people's lives, she said through tears.
But after he got involved with this network, all he cared about was maximizing revenue and increasing his billing. He became someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could look at elderly patients as nothing more than opportunities for profit. The personal testimony from family members of the convicted physicians added another dimension to understanding how the conspiracy had corrupted not just the healthcare system, but the lives and relationships of everyone connected to it. As the trials concluded and the conspiracy members received their sentences, I began to reflect on the long journey from my initial confrontation with Dr. Harrison to the conviction of dozens of healthcare providers involved in systematic patient exploitation. The experience had transformed me from a passive patient who trusted medical authority without question into an informed advocate who understood the importance of questioning, challenging, and demanding accountability from healthcare providers. It had been a painful but ultimately empowering transformation that had given my life a new sense of purpose and meaning. The broader impact of exposing the fraud conspiracy extended far beyond the criminal convictions. Insurance companies had implemented new fraud detection systems specifically designed to identify age-discriminatory billing patterns. Medical boards had strengthened their oversight procedures and created new mechanisms for reporting suspected patient exploitation. Medical schools had begun incorporating training about age bias and patient advocacy into their curricula. Perhaps most importantly, older patients themselves had become more assertive and informed about their healthcare rights. The fraud conspiracy had been exposed in large part because patients had learned to recognize the warning signs of dismissive treatment and had found the courage to speak up when they suspected something was wrong. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that Dr. Harrison's dismissive words about accepting that I wasn't getting any younger had inadvertently sparked a movement that would protect thousands of older patients from similar exploitation in the future. His attempt to use my age against me had ultimately become the foundation for ensuring that age would never again be used as a weapon against vulnerable patients seeking proper medical care. 2 years after the final convictions in the healthcare fraud conspiracy, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my bathroom, preparing for what would be my last major speaking engagement about the case. The American Medical Association had invited me to deliver the keynote address at their annual ethics conference, and I wanted to look my best for what felt like a culminating moment in this unexpected chapter of my life. At 62, I looked and felt better than I had in years. My thyroid medication was perfectly calibrated, my vitamin D levels were optimal, and I had the kind of energy and vitality that Dr. Harrison had tried to convince me were impossible at my age. The contrast between who I was now and who I had been during those months of dismissive treatment was almost startling. Dr. Chen had become not just my physician but a close friend and collaborator in the advocacy work that had grown out of exposing the fraud conspiracy. She had been instrumental in developing new protocols for recognizing age discrimination in medical settings and had testified alongside me at several medical conferences about the importance of taking older patients' concerns seriously. "Elena, you look radiant," she said when she picked me up for the drive to the conference center. "I know this speaking engagement feels like closure, but I hope you know how much your advocacy work has meant to patients across the country." The conference was being held at a resort in Scottsdale, and as we drove through the desert landscape, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that morning when Dr. Harrison had dismissed my symptoms as inevitable aging. What had started as a personal betrayal had evolved into a national movement to protect vulnerable patients from medical exploitation. The auditorium was packed with physicians, medical students, healthcare administrators, and patient advocates from across the country. Many of the audience members had been following the fraud conspiracy case since its initial exposure, and some had implemented changes in their own practices based on what they had learned about age discrimination in healthcare. As I walked to the podium, I could see familiar faces in the audience. Agent Martinez was there, along with several other federal investigators who had worked on the case. Dr. Vasquez from Sunrise Health Partners was in the front row, smiling encouragingly. Even some of the other fraud victims had traveled to Arizona to hear my speech. Ladies and gentlemen, when I was 58 years old, my doctor told me I wasn't getting any younger and needed to accept that some things just wear out. I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. What he didn't tell me was that he was stealing millions of dollars from insurance companies while denying proper medical care to patients he viewed as too old to matter. The audience was completely silent as I described my experience with Dr. Harrison and the systematic age discrimination that had enabled his fraud scheme. I could see physicians in the audience taking notes, and several appeared genuinely shocked by the details of how age bias had been weaponized to exploit vulnerable patients. The fraud conspiracy we exposed wasn't just about money. I continued. It was about a fundamental failure to respect the dignity and worth of older patients. It was about physicians who had forgotten that aging is not a disease and that older patients deserve the same quality of care and attention as their younger counterparts. I spoke about the importance of recognizing unconscious bias in medical settings and the need for healthcare providers to examine their own assumptions about aging in older patients. I shared stories from other victims of the conspiracy and explained how their experiences had led to concrete changes in fraud detection systems and patient protection protocols. The physicians involved in this conspiracy counted on older patients being passive and compliant, I explained. They expected us to accept dismissive treatment without question and to trust their authority without demanding accountability. They were wrong about what older patients are capable of when we decide to fight back. The speech lasted 45 minutes and was followed by a standing ovation that went on for several minutes. During the question and answer session, physicians shared their own experiences with age bias in their training and practice, and many committed to implementing new protocols for ensuring older patients received appropriate care. One young resident physician raised her hand and asked, "Ms. Rodriguez, what advice do you have for healthcare providers who want to make sure they never contribute to the kind of discrimination you experienced?" "Listen to your patients," I replied. "Really listen. Don't dismiss symptoms because of a patient's age. Don't assume that aging explains everything. And most importantly, remember that the person sitting across from you has lived a full life, accumulated wisdom and experience, and deserves to be treated with the same respect you would want for your own grandparents." After the conference, I was approached by Dr. Michael Thompson, the dean of a prominent medical school in Colorado. He wanted to discuss the possibility of developing a permanent curriculum module based on my experiences and the lessons learned from the fraud conspiracy. "Ms. Rodriguez, we believe that integrating your story and the broader implications of this case into our medical ethics curriculum could help prevent future physicians from developing the kind of age bias that enabled Dr. Harrison's crimes," he explained. The idea of my experience becoming a permanent part of medical education was both humbling and empowering. If future physicians could learn from what had happened to me and thousands of other patients, perhaps similar conspiracies could be prevented entirely. Over the following months, I worked with Dr. Thompson's team to develop case studies, training materials, and assessment tools that would help medical students recognize and address age discrimination in healthcare settings. The curriculum module was eventually adopted by over 50 medical schools across the country. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The AARP contacted me about receiving their annual advocacy award for my work in protecting older patients from healthcare fraud and discrimination. The ceremony was scheduled for their national conference in Washington, D.C., and would be attended by thousands of older Americans who had been inspired by the fraud conspiracy case to become more assertive advocates for their own health care. Isabella accompanied me to Washington for the award ceremony, and we spent several days exploring the city and meeting with congressional staff members who were working on healthcare fraud prevention legislation. The experience felt like a full circle moment, from being a dismissed patient in Phoenix to being honored in the nation's capital for advocacy work that had grown out of that initial betrayal. The AARP ceremony was held in a massive ballroom filled with older Americans who had traveled from across the country to attend the conference. As I accepted the award, I looked out at an audience of people who represented exactly the demographic that Dr. Harrison and his co-conspirators had targeted for exploitation. This award belongs not just to me, but to every older patient who has ever been told that their symptoms don't matter because of their age, I said during my acceptance speech. It belongs to every person who has found the courage to question dismissive treatment and demand better care. And it belongs to every healthcare provider who treats older patients with the dignity and respect they deserve. The standing ovation that followed was emotional and prolonged, with many audience members wiping away tears. After the ceremony, I was approached by dozens of conference attendees who shared their own stories of age discrimination in healthcare and thanked me for giving them the courage to advocate for themselves. One woman, probably in her 70s, took my hands and said, "Elena, because of your story, I questioned my doctor when he tried to dismiss my chest pain as anxiety. It turned out I was having a heart attack. Your advocacy work literally saved my life." Stories like that made all the difficult moments of the investigation and trial process worthwhile. The fraud conspiracy had caused tremendous harm, but exposing it had also empowered thousands of patients to demand better treatment and refuse to accept age discrimination as normal. As my public advocacy work began to wind down, I found myself reflecting on the personal changes that had resulted from this unexpected journey. The experience had taught me that age could be a source of strength rather than limitation, that speaking truth to power was both necessary and possible, and that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for social change. Dr. Chen and I often discussed how the case had changed both of our perspectives on healthcare and aging. For her, treating the victims of Dr. Harrison's fraud scheme had reinforced the importance of taking all patients' concerns seriously, regardless of their age. For me, the experience had transformed my understanding of what it meant to be a patient and an advocate. "Elena, you've become the kind of patient that every good physician hopes to work with," Dr. Chen told me during one of our regular appointments. "You're informed, engaged, and assertive, but you're also collaborative and realistic about what medicine can and can't do." The relationship I had developed with Dr. Chen represented everything that had been missing from my interactions with Dr. Harrison. She listened carefully to my concerns, explained her reasoning clearly, and treated me as an intelligent partner in managing my health, rather than a burden to be managed efficiently. Our appointments typically lasted 30 to 45 minutes, with Dr. Chen asking detailed questions about how I was feeling and what concerns I might have. She ordered appropriate diagnostic tests based on my symptoms and risk factors, not based on what insurance companies were willing to pay for. Most importantly, she never attributed symptoms to my age without proper investigation. "The difference between good medical care and what you experienced with Dr. Harrison is really about respect," she explained. "Good physicians respect their patients' intelligence, their autonomy, and their right to receive appropriate care regardless of their age or any other demographic characteristic." As I approached my 63rd birthday, I found myself in better health than I had been in years and more confident about my ability to navigate the healthcare system effectively. The skills I had developed during the fraud investigation, questioning authority, demanding documentation, and seeking second opinions, had become permanent parts of how I approached my medical care. I had also become something of a resource for other older patients who were dealing with dismissive treatment or suspected healthcare fraud. Friends and acquaintances regularly asked me to review their medical records, attend appointments with them, or help them find new physicians when they were dissatisfied with their current care. The work was rewarding but also emotionally demanding. Each story of age discrimination or potential fraud reminded me of my own experience with Dr. Harrison and the systematic way that older patients continued to be undervalued and exploited within the healthcare system. One particularly memorable case involved helping my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had been experiencing memory problems that her physician attributed to normal aging. When I reviewed her medical records, I noticed that no cognitive testing had been performed, and no attempt had been made to rule out treatable causes of memory impairment. Mrs. Patterson switched to a geriatric specialist, who conducted a comprehensive evaluation and diagnosed her with vitamin B12 deficiency, a completely treatable condition that can cause memory problems when left unaddressed. Within 6 months of starting B12 supplements, her cognitive function had returned to normal. Elena, if you hadn't encouraged me to get a second opinion, I might have spent the rest of my life thinking I was developing dementia, Mrs. Patterson told me. Instead, I'm back to my normal self, all because someone was willing to do proper diagnostic testing. Stories like Mrs. Patterson's reinforced the importance of the advocacy work that had grown out of exposing Dr. Harrison's fraud scheme. The systematic changes that had resulted from the investigation were important, but individual patients still needed advocates who understood how to navigate the healthcare system effectively. As the 5th anniversary of Dr. Harrison's arrest approached, I received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons informing me that he had requested a meeting with me. According to the letter, Dr. Harrison wanted to apologize personally for the harm he had caused and to discuss his plans for when he was eventually released from prison. The request came as a complete surprise. I hadn't thought about Dr. Harrison in months, and I wasn't sure how I felt about the possibility of meeting with him again. Part of me was curious about what he might say, but part of me also felt that I had moved beyond needing any additional closure from our relationship. I discussed the request with Isabella, Doc Chen, and several other people whose judgment I trusted. The consensus was that I had no obligation to meet with Dr. Harrison, but that doing so might provide valuable insights into his mindset and the factors that had led to his criminal behavior. Ultimately, I decided to meet with him, not because I felt any need to forgive him, but because I was curious about what lessons might be learned from someone who had caused so much harm and had spent several years in prison reflecting on his actions. The meeting took place at the Federal Correctional Institution in Phoenix, in a small conference room under the supervision of prison officials. Dr. Harrison looked dramatically different from the distinguished physician I had known for over 20 years. His hair had gone completely gray, he had lost significant weight, and the confident demeanor that had defined his professional persona was entirely gone. "Elena, thank you for agreeing to see me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask for your time or attention after everything I did to you and to so many other patients." We talked for nearly 2 hours about the fraud scheme, its impact on victims, and the factors that had led him to betray his medical oath and exploit vulnerable patients. Dr. Harrison spoke candidly about his gambling addiction, financial pressures, and the gradual moral compromises that had eventually led to systematic patient exploitation. "I kept telling myself that I was providing adequate care while just maximizing revenue," he explained. "But the truth is, I stopped seeing my older patients as people deserving of respect and proper medical attention. I saw them as billing opportunities, and that dehumanization made it easier to justify what I was doing." The conversation was emotionally difficult, but also illuminating. Dr. Harrison's description of how he had rationalized his behavior provided insights into how healthcare fraud schemes develop and how they can be prevented in the future. "Elena, I want you to know that your willingness to confront me and expose what I was doing probably saved more lives than I destroyed," he said, as our meeting concluded. "The changes that resulted from this case have protected thousands of patients who might otherwise have been exploited by physicians like me." I left the prison feeling emotionally drained, but also oddly satisfied. The meeting had provided closure I hadn't realized I needed, and had reinforced my belief that speaking out against injustice, even when it's difficult and painful, is ultimately worthwhile. Today at 65, I continue to work part-time as a consultant while spending increasing amounts of time on healthcare advocacy and patient education. The experience with Dr. Harrison's fraud scheme transformed my life in ways I never could have anticipated, giving me a sense of purpose and accomplishment that goes far beyond anything I achieved in my business career. The broader impact of the case continues to unfold. The federal legislation that resulted from the investigation has led to stronger fraud detection systems and better protection for older patients across the country. Medical schools continue to incorporate lessons from the case into their curricula, and healthcare providers have become more aware of age bias and its potential consequences. Most importantly, older patients themselves have become more assertive and informed advocates for their own healthcare. The fraud conspiracy case became a catalyst for changing the fundamental dynamics between older patients and the medical system, empowering people to demand appropriate care and refuse to accept age discrimination as normal. When people ask me what I learned from this experience, I tell them that age is not a limitation but a source of wisdom and strength. Getting older doesn't mean accepting substandard treatment or diminished expectations. It means having the experience and confidence to demand respect, question authority, and fight for what's right. Dr. Harrison was wrong when he told me I wasn't getting any younger. I was getting stronger, wiser, and more determined to ensure that no other patient would experience the betrayal and exploitation that I had endured. Sometimes the most powerful response to someone trying to diminish you because of your age is to prove just how formidable older people can be when they decide to fight back. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.